The jaws closed around scruff and bone with enough force to snap a neck, and the dog went limp, not from death, but from the instant absolute surrender of prey that knows resistance means tearing. The lioness lifted him clear off the ground, his mongrel body dangling like a rag, his brown eyes rolling white with terror, and she carried him in silence through the tall grass toward the rocky outcrop where her 3 cubs waited. Blood from his shoulder, where her canines had punctured skin, dripped onto the red earth in a trail of dots, each one a marker of what should have been his final journey. But when she dropped him 10 meters from the den entrance, when his body hit the ground and her massive paw pinned him there, when her golden eyes locked onto his and her mouth opened to deliver the killing bite, the dog did something impossible. He whimpered, soft and broken, and from his throat came a sound she knew, a sound that stopped her cold, the crying of something desperate to protect young. Wait. Before the next revelation happens, if this bond between these creatures has already touched you, tell us where you're watching from. To witness every act of courage, every impossible friendship, and every silent miracle of nature, subscribe and join our circle. The next moment will change everything. Now, back to the wild. Part 1. The Incident and the Proposition. The lioness had been hunting for 63 hours. Her cubs, 2 males and 1 female, barely 8 weeks old, were hidden in a crevice between ancient granite boulders in the eastern reaches of the Serengeti, a place she had chosen for its defensibility and isolation. Their father was dead, killed 3 weeks ago by a coalition of younger males who had swept through the territory like a plague, killing cubs and driving out the resident males in their brutal quest for genetic dominance. She had managed to hide her 3 before the killers found them, had kept them silent through sheer force of will and maternal fury, had survived by becoming invisible. But survival required food. The cubs were weaning, demanding more than milk, and she was gaunt from weeks of insufficient feeding, her ribs visible beneath golden fur, her teats sagging and dry. She needed to kill, needed to feed, needed to restore her strength before the milk stopped entirely and her cubs starved despite her best efforts. She had stalked a young zebra for 2 days, but a hyena clan had driven her from the kill before she could eat. She had cornered a warthog, but it had escaped into its burrow, reversing at impossible speed, its tusks flashing a warning. She had even considered scavenging from a leopard's cache, but the risk of confrontation in her weakened state was too great. And then she had smelled the dog. It was an alien scent in this place, domestic canine mixed with desperation and the particular musk of an animal living rough. The smell had drifted on the morning wind from the direction of the abandoned ranger station 3 kilometers to the west, the place where humans had lived before the drought and the budget cuts had forced them to consolidate operations elsewhere. The lioness had approached cautiously, her belly low to the ground, her mind calculating calories against effort. A domestic dog would be easy prey, no wild instincts, no proper fear, meat that would feed her cubs and restore her strength. She had found him near the old station's collapsed fence, digging in the red soil with frantic determination. He was medium-sized, maybe 20 kilograms, his coat a dirty brown and white patchwork that spoke of mixed breeding and hard living. His ribs showed like hers, his paws were cracked and bleeding, and his eyes held the particular madness of an animal pushed beyond normal limits. He had not sensed her until too late. She had waited until he was fully absorbed in his digging, had calculated distance and angle, and had launched herself from cover in a burst of speed that covered 15 meters in less than 2 seconds. The dog had time for one startled yelp before her jaws closed around his shoulder and neck, the grip carefully calibrated, Hard enough to subdue, not quite hard enough to kill immediately. She wanted him alive for the carry, wanted the meat as fresh as possible for her cubs. But as she lifted him, as his paws left the ground and his body went slack in the instinctive surrender of captured prey, something strange happened. The hole he had been digging, which she had assumed was random desperation or search for insects, revealed itself to be something else entirely. In the exposed earth, no more than half a meter down, were 4 puppies. They were tiny, perhaps 3 weeks old, their eyes barely open, their bodies pressed together in a furry mass that squirmed and whimpered at the sudden exposure to light and air. They were the dog's puppies, hidden in the only shelter he could find, buried to protect them from the sun and predators while he searched for food in a landscape that offered neither mercy nor abundance. The lioness had seen them for only a second before instinct drove her to move, to carry her prey away from the area, to return to her cubs with food. But in that second, something registered. The parallel, the mirror, the terrible symmetry of 2 parents trying to keep offspring alive in a world designed to kill them. She carried the dog through the grass, his blood marking the trail, his body occasionally twitching with involuntary muscle spasms. He did not fight. He had felt the power of her jaws, understood the futility of resistance. But his eyes, visible when she shifted her grip, were not the glazed eyes of dying prey. They were focused, alert, tracking their movement, oriented backward toward the hole where his puppies lay exposed and helpless. When she reached the outcrop and dropped him, when her paw pinned him to prevent escape, she had intended to make the kill quick. Her cubs would hear the commotion and emerge to feed. They needed to learn the mechanics of consumption, to tear meat from bone, to understand that survival meant taking life. But then the dog had made that sound, that particular whimper that transcended species, that carried in its broken notes the universal language of parental desperation. And the lioness, whose own cubs were hidden in the rocks behind her, whose own mate was dead, whose own survival hung by the thinnest thread, had frozen. Her jaws had opened, her teeth had positioned for the killing bite, but she did not close them. Instead, she looked at the dog, really looked at him, and saw in his eyes not the dull acceptance of prey, but something that resembled what she felt every moment of every day. The crushing weight of responsibility for lives that depend entirely on her continued existence, the terror of failure, the willingness to die if death meant protection for young. The dog whimpered again, softer now. His brown eyes held hers, and slowly, carefully, with movements that could easily be interpreted as attack or escape, he turned his head back toward the direction from which they had come. Toward the abandoned station, toward the hole, toward the puppies who would be dead by nightfall if he did not return. The lioness understood, not through language, not through reason, but through the deep mammalian circuitry that governs maternal behavior, that creates bonds stronger than survival instinct, that makes mothers of all species recognize each other across the boundaries of predator and prey. She lifted her paw. The dog did not move. He remained motionless except for the rapid rise and fall of his chest, his eyes locked on hers, waiting to see if this was mercy or merely a delay of the inevitable. The lioness stepped back, 1 step, 2 steps, creating distance, creating possibility, creating a choice that should not have existed. The dog's muscles tensed, his legs gathered beneath him. But he did not bolt immediately, did not trust the reality of what was happening. Instead, he rose slowly to a sitting position, his wounded shoulder dripping blood, his gaze never leaving the lioness's face. They stayed like that for a long moment, the lioness and the dog, predator and prey, Two parents suspended in the impossible space between violence and understanding. And then, from the rocks behind the lioness, came a sound that shattered the frozen tableau, the mewling cry of a hungry cub. The lioness's head snapped around. Her maternal instinct flared, overriding everything else. Her cubs were calling, were emerging from the den, were approaching with the fearless innocence of young things that did not yet understand the world's dangers. Three small shapes tumbled from between the boulders, gold and spotted, their oversized paws and ears giving them the endearing awkwardness of all baby predators. They saw their mother and bounded toward her with joyful abandon, their voices rising in demanding chorus, "Feed us, protect us, love us." The dog saw them too, and something in his posture changed, not aggression, but recognition. Cubs, young, lives that depended on the lioness the way his puppies depended on him. The lioness turned back to the dog, and a decision formed in her mind that defied every instinct, every lesson learned from her own mother, every rule of survival that had kept her alive through 5 years in the Serengeti. She made a sound, low, rumbling, neither threat nor welcome, but something in between. A sound that might have meant go, or might have meant stay. Or might have meant something more complex that only she understood. The dog stood fully now, his legs shaking, his wounded shoulders soaking his fur with blood. He looked at the lioness. He looked at her cubs, who had reached their mother and were pressing against her legs, demanding attention, oblivious to the strange creature bleeding 10 meters away. And then he made his own decision. He did not run toward the abandoned station. He did not flee for his life while the opportunity existed. Instead, he sat, simply lowered his haunches back to the ground, wrapped his tail around his feet, and waited. It was submission. It was trust. It was the gamble of a desperate parent who understood that his puppies would die if he died, who saw in this lioness the only possible salvation, who chose to place his fate in her paws because sometimes in the wild's impossible mathematics, surrender is the only path to survival. The lioness growled, low, warning. Her cubs startled and pressed closer to her. The dog lowered his head but did not move otherwise. They stayed like that as the sun climbed higher, as the heat began to build, as the moment stretched and bent under the weight of decision. The lioness could kill him now, would kill him, should kill him. Her cubs needed food, and here was food sitting willingly in front of her. But she did not move, and neither did the dog. And slowly, gradually, the impossible proposition took shape between them. Your cubs need food. My puppies need protection. You cannot leave them to hunt. I cannot feed mine alone. We are both dying. Perhaps we die slower together. It was not spoken. It was not even fully understood. But it hung in the air between them like heat shimmer, a possibility so strange that the savannah itself seemed to pause, to watch, to wait and see if two species separated by millions of years of evolution could find common ground in the simple fact of loving their young more than they valued their own lives. The lioness made her decision. She turned from the dog and walked toward the den entrance. Her cubs followed, tumbling over each other in their eagerness. And at the entrance, she stopped and looked back. The dog remained sitting, watching. The lioness rumbled again, not a growl now, but something closer to the sound she made when calling her cubs. A sound of invitation, of conditional acceptance, of a contract offered that would bind them both to something unprecedented and fragile and possibly fatal. The dog stood. He took one step forward, then another, moving slowly, carefully,
his body language screaming submission and respect and desperate hope. The lioness did not attack. She watched him approach, her tail lashing with tension, her muscles coiled for violence if needed. Her cubs watched too, curious now, tilting their heads at the strange creature that smelled wrong but moved like prey that had given up running. When the dog was 5 meters away, the lioness went into the den. Her cubs followed. And after a moment of hesitation that contained his entire future, the dog followed too. Into the darkness between the boulders. Into the lioness's home. Into a situation that should have meant his immediate death, but that somehow, impossibly, meant something else entirely. The proposition had been made. The terms were unspoken, but understood. And as the sun reached its zenith, and the savanna baked under equatorial heat, 2 parents, one feline, one canine, began an experiment in survival that would either save them all or doom them all. And there was no way to know which until it was far too late to turn back.
Part 2. The Labyrinth of Instinct. The den was cooler than the outside air by perhaps 10 degrees. Not comfortable but survivable, a pocket of shade and relative safety carved by time and weather into the granite outcrop. The lioness positioned herself at the deepest point, her back against stone, her body creating a barrier between the entrance and her cubs. The cubs pressed against her belly, seeking milk that came reluctantly, their mouths working with the aggressive desperation of young things that sensed scarcity. The dog remained near the entrance, his body pressed flat against the rock floor, every line of his posture declaring submission. Blood from his shoulder had slowed to a seep, clotting in his fur, but the wounds were not fatal. Careful bites that had subdued without destroying, that had announced predation without completing it. The lioness watched him constantly. Her pupils, adjusted to the dimness, tracked his every breath, every twitch, every flicker of movement. She was operating outside all normal parameters now, hosting prey in her den, suppressing the killing instinct that should have been overwhelming. It cost her something, a constant tension that hummed through her body, a readiness to explode into violence if the dog made any move that could be threat. But the dog made no such move. He simply lay still, his breathing shallow, his eyes half closed in the universal signal of non-aggression. Occasionally, his gaze would drift toward the den entrance, toward the direction of the abandoned station, where his puppies lay in their exposed hole, and his body would tremble with the effort of not running, not abandoning this insane gamble to return to them. The cubs finished nursing, or gave up on the insufficient milk, and their attention shifted to the dog. The boldest, one of the males, took a few stumbling steps toward the strange creature, his small nose twitching with curiosity, his tail attempting the confident lash of a predator, but achieving only the uncoordinated flop of a kitten. The dog went absolutely still. Even his breathing seemed to stop. He understood that these cubs were the key to everything, that if they perceived him as toy or prey, if they attacked with their small teeth and claws, and their mother saw him defend himself, the fragile truce would shatter instantly and terminally. The cub reached the dog and sniffed his face. Small nostrils flared, taking in the scent of canine and blood and fear. The dog's eyes stayed carefully unfocused, looking past the cub rather than at it, avoiding any hint of challenge or threat. The cub reached out with one oversized paw and batted the dog's nose. The dog did not react, did not flinch, did not snap, did not move at all. He absorbed the blow, gentle by adult standards, but carrying the full force of cub enthusiasm, and remained motionless as stone. The cub lost interest and wandered back to its mother. The lioness's tail had been lashing throughout the interaction, her body coiled to spring, but she did not intervene. The dog had passed the first test, had shown that he would not harm her cubs even when struck, even when their needle and curiosity tested his patience.
But tests came in many forms. As midday heat peaked, the lioness rose and moved to the den entrance. She looked out at the landscape, shimmering air, scattered acacia, the distant glitter of a waterhole that held more mud than liquid. She was thirsty. She needed to drink. But leaving the cubs meant leaving them alone with the dog, meant trusting that he would not kill them in her absence. She turned back to look at him. Her amber eyes held his brown ones, and something passed between them. A question, a warning, a statement of stakes.
She rumbled low in her chest, a sound that vibrated through the rock and that carried undeniable meaning. If I return and my cubs are harmed, your death will be measured in days, not minutes. Then she left, walked out of the den and disappeared into the heat shimmer, moving toward water with the ground-eating stride of a hunting lion, leaving her cubs alone with a creature she had tried to kill just hours before. The dog remained motionless for a long moment after she departed. The cubs, freed from their mother's constraining presence, began to play, pouncing on each other, wrestling with clumsy ferocity, their growls high-pitched and unthreatening. They ignored the dog completely, treating him like another rock or shadow in their environment. Slowly, carefully, the dog raised his head. He looked at the cubs. He looked at the den entrance. He had perhaps 30 minutes before the lioness returned. Enough time to run, to reach his puppies, to be there when the hyenas or jackals or heat or simple abandonment killed them. But if he left, the lioness would assume betrayal, would hunt him down, would kill him and his puppies both, would erase his entire genetic line because he had violated her trust. The gamble required commitment, required staying, required faith that this impossible alliance could somehow serve both their needs. The dog lowered his head back to the stone and closed his eyes. He did not sleep, could not sleep with the lioness gone and danger everywhere, but he rested his body while his mind calculated survival in equations that had no clear solution. The lioness returned after 20 minutes. She entered the den alert and ready, her eyes immediately seeking her cubs, counting them, checking for injury or distress. They were fine, tumbling over each other near the back wall, completely unharmed, completely unconcerned. She looked at the dog. He had not moved from his position near the entrance. Had not approached the cubs, had not left, had kept his promise, though no promise had been explicitly made. The lioness walked to her cubs and began grooming them roughly with her tongue, checking their bodies with the thoroughness of a mother who trusted nothing. When she was satisfied, she settled down and allowed them to nurse again, though little came and the cubs complained with frustrated mules. The dog watched this, saw the lioness's hunger reflected in her cubs' desperation, understood that this situation was unsustainable, that without food the cubs would weaken and die, and the lioness would have no reason to maintain the truce. He stood. The movement brought the lioness's immediate attention, her body tensing, her lips pulling back slightly to reveal canines designed for killing. The dog took a step toward the entrance. The lioness growled, low, warning. The dog stopped, then turned his body sideways, showing his full profile, his wounded shoulder, his submission. Then he took another step toward the entrance. The lioness understood. The dog was asking permission to leave, was communicating intent rather than simply acting, was showing respect for her authority over the den space. She did not growl again. She watched as the dog moved to the entrance, paused there, looked back at her one more time, his eyes asking a question his throat could not voice,
and then stepped out into the brutal afternoon heat. The lioness waited. Her cubs nursed and complained. Time stretched. The shadows began to lengthen as afternoon aged toward evening, and still the dog did not return. The lioness's tension grew. Had he fled? Had he abandoned the proposition? Had she been wrong to trust, wrong to gamble her cub's safety on the word of prey? Then, as the sun touched the horizon and the day's heat began to break, a sound came from outside the den. A sound she knew, but that made no sense in this context. Barking. The lioness moved to the entrance cautiously. The cubs, curious and foolish, tried to follow, but she blocked them with her body and peered out into the red-gold light of sunset. The dog was there, perhaps 20 meters away. And beside him, arranged in a line like offerings, were 3 freshly killed creatures. A monitor lizard, a rock hyrax, and a young dik-dik. The smallest antelope, barely 4 kilograms, its neck broken cleanly. The dog sat behind his kills, his chest heaving with exhaustion, his mouth hanging open, his tongue lolling. He had hunted, had spent the afternoon catching what he could catch, not the large prey that lions specialized in, but the small, quick things that a desperate dog could run down through persistence and need. It was not enough to feed a lioness, but it was enough to feed 3 cubs. Was enough to give them something solid in their bellies, to supplement the failing milk, to keep them alive for another day. The dog barked again, then backed away from the kills. The meaning was clear. These are for your cubs. This is my contribution. This is why you should keep me alive. The lioness emerged from the den fully. She approached the kills warily, sniffing them, checking for poison or disease or trap. But they were clean, fresh meat killed with canine efficiency, offered with canine desperation. She picked up the dik-dik in her jaws and carried it back to the den. Her cubs mobbed her immediately, their small growls fierce and possessive. She tore the carcass open for them, showing them how to feed. And they attacked the meat with savage joy, their muzzles quickly soaked in blood, their bellies finally receiving something substantial. The lioness returned for the other kills. She brought them to the den entrance and consumed them herself, not because she needed the meager calories, but because accepting the offering formalized the contract, acknowledged the dog's role, transformed him from prey to something unprecedented, provider. When she emerged again, her muzzle cleaned of blood, she found the dog sitting in the same position, waiting. She walked toward him, and he lowered his head to the ground, complete submission, his neck exposed in the ultimate gesture of trust. She stood over him. Her breath moved his fur. Her weight could crush him. For a long moment, she simply held the position. Dominance established, hierarchy clear, the rules of their arrangement unmistakable. Then she did something that would have shocked any observer who understood lion behavior. She groomed him. Her rough tongue dragged across his wounded shoulder, cleaning the puncture wounds she had inflicted, her saliva carrying antibacterial properties that would help prevent infection. It was not affection, not yet. It was practical care of an asset, maintenance of something that had proven useful. But it was also recognition, acknowledgement that the dog had kept his word, had returned, had provided, had earned the right to continue existing in the impossible space they now shared. When she finished, she walked back to the den. She paused at the entrance and made the calling sound again, the rumble that meant, "Come." The dog stood and followed, back into the darkness, back into the lioness's home. But this time he was not intruder or prisoner. He was something else, partner perhaps, or collaborator, or simply another parent trying to keep young alive in a world that specialized in killing them. The cubs, bloated with meat and exhausted from feeding,
paid him no attention. The lioness settled into her position at the back of the den, and the dog took up a new position, not pressed against the entrance, but closer to the center, near the cubs but not threatening them, part of the family unit rather than outside it. And as darkness claimed the savanna completely, as the night sounds began, hyenas whooping in the distance, a leopard's sawing cough, the shriek of something small dying, the lioness closed her eyes and allowed herself something she had not experienced in weeks: rest. Not because the dog could protect her cubs from real threat, but because he could watch while she slept, could alert if danger approached, could share the exhausting burden of constant vigilance that parenthood demanded. It was not trust, not yet, but it was the beginning of trust, the first fragile thread of alliance that might strengthen or might snap, but that for tonight, for this moment, was enough. Part 3. The Revelation and the Fracture. The pattern held for 3 days. The lioness would rest during the brutal midday heat, her cubs sleeping against her belly while the dog kept watch near the den entrance. Then, as afternoon mellowed toward evening, the dog would leave to hunt. He had a route now, a circuit that took him through the territory where small prey concentrated, where he could catch lizards and hyraxes, where he had found a family of ground squirrels whose burrow he raided with systematic efficiency. He would return at dusk with whatever he had killed, and the cubs would feed. The lioness would eat sparingly from his offerings. They were too small to sustain her massive metabolism, but she accepted them as tribute, as evidence of the dog's continued commitment to the arrangement. On the 4th night, something changed. The dog had left as usual, heading into the gathering darkness with the determined gait of someone whose survival depended on success. But this time, when he reached the abandoned ranger station, when he approached the collapsed fence where his puppies lay hidden, he stopped. The hole had been disturbed. Fresh dirt was scattered around the opening, paw prints pressed into the red soil, prints he recognized immediately as Jackal. The scavengers had found his cache, had been digging, had been trying to reach the puppies buried in their shallow den. The dog's barking became frantic. He dug at the hole with renewed desperation, his cracked paws bleeding as he widened the entrance, his mind consumed with terror about what he would find. The puppies were alive, all 4 of them, pressed into the deepest corner of their chamber, whimpering with fear but unharmed. The jackals had not managed to reach them yet. The entrance was too narrow, the chamber too deep for their clever but cautious nature. But they would return. They always returned. And next time, they might dig longer, might persist until they reached the helpless young. The dog understood with absolute clarity. He could not leave them here anymore. This location was compromised. His puppies would be dead within days if he continued the current arrangement. He had to bring them to the only safe place he knew, the lioness's den. It was insane. It was suicide. Bringing puppies to a hungry lioness was not cooperation, but delivery of food, not alliance, but sacrifice. But every alternative led to certain death for his offspring, while this path led only to possible death. In the brutal mathematics of survival, possible always trumped certain. He gathered the first puppy carefully in his mouth. A male, barely a kilogram, eyes still cloudy with newborn blindness. The puppy squeaked in protest, but quieted when the dog's warmth surrounded it. He climbed from the hole and began the long journey back to the granite outcrop, carrying his genetic future in jaws that trembled with exhaustion and fear. The journey took 3 times longer than usual. He could not run with the puppy in his mouth, could not risk dropping it or crushing it. He walked carefully through the darkness, alert for every sound, every movement, every hint of predators that would find a dog carrying a puppy an irresistible target. He reached the outcrop as the moon rose, a three-quarter disk that turned the savanna silver and black. The lioness was lying at the den entrance, enjoying the relative cool, her cubs tumbling around her in the moonlight. She saw the dog approach and tensed immediately, her predator instincts firing at the sight of prey, small prey, helpless prey, the kind her cubs needed to practice killing. The dog stopped 10 meters away. He set the puppy down gently, then stepped back from it, creating distance, making clear that he was not asking the lioness to accept the puppy, but showing her what he had, what he was protecting, what his desperation had driven him to bring into her domain. The puppy, freed from the dog's mouth, began to crawl in aimless circles, mewling, a sound remarkably similar to the lion's cubs' cries, a frequency that triggered mammalian care responses across species boundaries. The lioness's cubs heard it. The boldest male bounded toward the puppy, curious about the small, squeaking thing. The lioness's instinct was to stop him, to protect him from potential disease or danger. But she watched instead, wanting to see what would happen, what her cub would do with this offering. The cub reached the puppy and sniffed it thoroughly. The puppy, sensing warmth and size, crawled toward the cub and pressed against it, seeking comfort. The cub, confused but not threatened, sat down. The puppy cuddled closer. And something remarkable happened. The cub began to groom the puppy. Small, rough licks across the puppy's head, mimicking what the cub had seen its mother do, practicing care behaviors that were hardwired into its development. The lioness watched this interaction with something like fascination. Her cub was treating the puppy as a sibling, not as prey, not as threat, but as another small, helpless thing that needed protection. The dog watched too, his body rigid with tension, prepared to fight to the death if the lioness or her cubs moved to kill his offspring. But no such move came. The lioness simply observed, her tail swishing with thought, her mind processing this new development in their arrangement. After a long moment, she stood and walked toward the puppy. The dog's body language screamed warning, readiness, desperate courage. But the lioness ignored him. She reached the puppy, sniffed it carefully, then picked it up gently in her jaws, the same grip she used to carry her own cubs, and carried it into the den. The dog's world fractured. His puppy had disappeared into the darkness with a predator. Every instinct screamed pursuit, attack, rescue. But he held position, trembling, waiting to see if this was mercy or horror. The lioness emerged from the den without the puppy. She looked at the dog, made the calling rumble, "Come," and disappeared back inside. The dog followed on legs that barely supported him. His vision had narrowed to a tunnel, his breathing ragged with fear. He entered the den and stopped, letting his eyes adjust. The puppy was there, placed among the lion cubs, who were sniffing it with great interest. The lioness had positioned it near her belly, in the same location where her own cubs nursed. She had accepted it into her den space, had granted it the protection she gave her own offspring. But there were 3 more puppies still at the ranger station. The dog looked at the lioness. She looked back at him. And somehow, in that exchange of gazes, she understood. This was not complete. There were more. He needed to bring them. She rumbled again, not calling this time, but permission. "Go, bring them. We will see." The dog left immediately. He ran through the moonlight with new hope and new terror, his mind unable to process what was happening, but his body driven by pure need. He reached the ranger station, gathered the second puppy, and began the journey back. By dawn, all 4 puppies were in the den, arranged among the lion cubs like interlopers at a feast. The lioness lay among them,
3 lion cubs and 4 dog puppies, a pile of spotted gold and dirty brown, nursing and sleeping and existing in defiance of every natural law. But acceptance by the lioness did not mean safety, not completely. It meant conditional protection, a day-to-day decision that could reverse at any moment. The dog understood this. He maintained his hunting routine, bringing food daily. But now he brought more, pushed himself harder, hunted longer, caught bigger prey. He found a guinea fowl roosting too low. He cornered a young mongoose. He raided a termite mound and brought back protein-rich insects by the mouthful. The lioness watched his efforts with something that might have been approval. He was providing not just for her cubs now, but for his own puppies, was contributing to the collective food supply, was earning the right to have his offspring protected by her strength and presence. But the situation's fragility became apparent on the 7th day, when the puppy's eyes opened fully and they began to walk with more confidence. One of the puppies, a female with a white patch on her chest, wandered too close to where the lioness was feeding on a hyrax. The cub reached out with curious paws, touched the meat, tried to take a piece. The lioness's response was immediate. She snarled and batted the puppy away with force that sent the small body tumbling. The puppy yelped, pain and shock, and the dog exploded into motion. He crossed the den in a blur, positioned himself between the lioness and his puppy, his teeth bared for the first time since their arrangement began, his growl low and deadly serious.
The lioness rose to her full height. Her size dwarfed the dog. Her power was absolute. But the dog did not back down. His puppy was hurt, possibly injured, and every instinct in his body demanded protection, even if protection meant death. The den filled with tension so thick it seemed solid. The cubs scattered to the walls, sensing danger. The puppies whimpered in confusion. And the two parents, feline and canine, predator and former prey, faced each other with the alliance they had built hanging by its thinnest thread. The lioness could kill the dog in seconds. She had the tools, the training, the overwhelming advantage. But doing so would mean losing his contribution, losing his hunting skills, losing the extra food that was keeping her cubs fed while she conserved strength. And some part of her, some deep mammalian recognition, understood that the dog's aggression was not threat, but the same protective fury she felt whenever her own cubs faced danger. Slowly, deliberately, the lioness lowered her body back down. She turned her attention away from the dog and his puppy, resuming her feeding, dismissing the confrontation through the simple act of ignoring it. The dog remained in protective stance for another minute, then carefully gathered his injured puppy and carried it to the far side of the den. He examined the puppy thoroughly, bruised but not broken, scared but alive. The lioness's blow had been calibrated, he realized. She could have killed the puppy with casual ease, but she had only disciplined it, corrected it, taught it the same harsh lesson she would have taught her own cubs. Respect the food chain. Know your place. The dog licked his puppy's fur, soothing it, and slowly his body relaxed. The immediate crisis had passed. But the fracture it revealed could not be ignored. This arrangement worked only as long as everyone understood the rules, only as long as boundaries were maintained, only as long as the lioness decided that the benefits outweighed the risks. And those benefits were starting to shift. The dog's small kills were sustaining the cubs, but the lioness herself was deteriorating. She needed large prey, zebra, wildebeest, gazelle, and she could not hunt effectively while guarding the den and all its young. Her ribs showed more prominently each day. Her movements were slower, her reaction times dulled by hunger. The equation was changing. Soon, very soon, she would need to make a choice.
Leave the den to hunt properly and risk the cub's safety, or stay and slowly starve while the dog's meager offerings kept her just alive enough to watch her own decline. That evening, when the dog returned with 3 rock hyraxes, his most successful hunt yet, the lioness did not eat. She gave all the meat to the cubs and puppies, watched them feed with savage efficiency, and when they were done, she rose and walked to the den entrance. She looked out at the darkening savanna. Then she looked back at the dog, and in her eyes was a question that had no good answer. Can you protect them if I go? Can you keep 7 young against everything that will come for them? The dog had no way to answer. He was strong for his size, but no match for hyenas, for jackals in numbers, for male lions who might discover the den. He could fight, could die bravely, but he could not win against serious threats. The lioness understood this. She rumbled low, frustration, fear, anger at the impossible situation. Then she made her decision. She would leave at dawn to hunt. She would be gone for perhaps 12 hours, maybe more. And the dog would guard the den alone, would stand against whatever came, would buy time with his life if necessary. It was not a good plan. It was not even a viable plan. But it was the only plan that offered any possibility of them all surviving. The lioness settled down for one more night of rest. The cubs and puppies piled against her belly, warm and safe for now, their small bodies oblivious to the calculations being made above them, the terrible arithmetic of survival that never balanced, that always demanded more than anyone had to give. And the dog, lying near the entrance, understood that tomorrow would test them all, would reveal whether their impossible alliance was strong enough to withstand the real world's pressure, or whether it would shatter and leave them all exposed to the savannah's indifferent cruelty. Part 4. The Return and the Trial. The lioness left before dawn, when the world was caught in that strange gray light that belongs neither to night nor day. She did not say goodbye. Animals don't, because goodbye implies understanding of absence and time, concepts that live in instinct rather than thought. She simply rose, stretched with the careful extension of a body running on empty, and walked out of the den into the cool pre-dawn air. The dog watched her go. He had not slept, had kept vigil through the night, preparing mentally for what was coming. When the lioness's golden form disappeared into the thorn bush, he moved to the den entrance and sat, positioning himself as the first line of defense against everything that would come. The cubs and puppies slept on, exhausted from play and feeding, their small bodies intertwined in a pile that blurred species lines. 3 lion cubs, 4 dog puppies, 7 young lives that depended entirely on the adults who had formed this fragile alliance. The sun rose, the heat built, and the waiting began. The first threat came at mid-morning. A pair of black-backed jackals who had been tracking the scent of young animals for days. They appeared from the west, trotting with the confident purpose of predators who knew easy prey when they smelled it. They saw the dog at the den entrance and stopped, their ears pricked forward, their bodies tense with calculation. The dog stood and growled, low, serious, a sound that carried all his desperation and determination. He was bigger than the jackals individually, but there were 2 of them and 1 of him, and they were wild while he was domesticated, carriers of instincts that had been bred out of his kind generations ago. The jackals split up, circling, trying to flank him. Classic pack tactics, trying to divide his attention, looking for the moment when his focus shift and one of them could dart past him into the den. The dog backed up until his hind quarters were touching the den entrance. He could retreat no further, could not let them get behind him. His growl intensified, rising in pitch, adding bark to the threat, trying to project size and danger he did not truly possess. The larger jackal feinted left. The dog tracked the movement, teeth bared. The smaller jackal saw the opening and darted right, trying to slip past while the dog was focused on its partner. But the dog had anticipated this, had spent days watching the lion cubs play, learning their pack tactics, absorbing lessons about cooperation and deception. He spun faster than the jackal expected, caught it mid-dash with a bite that closed on the scruff of its neck and threw it sideways with all his strength. The jackal yelped and scrambled away, surprised by the dog's speed and ferocity. The larger jackal reconsidered its approach, circling wider, reassessing the threat. From inside the den came small sounds, the cubs and puppies waking, sensing tension, beginning to stir. The dog barked sharply toward the den entrance, a command, a warning: stay back, stay hidden, do not come out. The jackals heard the sounds from inside. Their interest intensified. They knew now that the den contained young, could hear the specific frequency of cub and puppy vocalizations. Their predatory drive strengthened, overriding caution. They rushed together this time, coordinated, both coming from the same direction to overwhelm the dog with simultaneous attack. The dog met them head-on, abandoning the den entrance to engage them in open space, gambling that he could drive them off before they could circle behind him. The fight was brief and vicious. Teeth flashed, blood flew, mostly the dog's, from a gash across his already injured shoulder, from punctures in his flank. But the dog fought with the fury of a parent protecting young, fought beyond his training and breeding, fought with a savagery that surprised the jackals and cost them. The smaller jackal took a bite across its face that opened the skin to bone. The larger jackal received punctures in its leg that made it stumble. And both of them, confronted with resistance far more intense than they had expected for such small prey, made the calculation that all predators eventually make: the cost exceeds the benefit. They retreated, limping, bleeding, their opportunistic natures accepting that easier meals existed elsewhere. They disappeared into the bush, and the dog stood panting in the red dust, his body shaking with adrenaline and exhaustion, blood dripping from his wounds to mix with the dirt. He limped back to the den entrance and collapsed there, every muscle trembling. Inside the den, curious faces appeared, cubs and puppies, drawn by the sounds of combat, wanting to see what had happened. The dog growled at them, gentle but firm, and they retreated back into the darkness, instinctively obeying the authority of the adult who had just proven his willingness to bleed for them. The morning's heat intensified. The dog's wounds throbbed with pain and the promise of infection. He was desperately thirsty, desperately tired, but he could not leave the den entrance, could not abandon his post. He simply lay there, watching the bush, waiting for the next threat. It came at midday, when the heat was a physical presence, when even predators usually rested. A young male lion, not fully mature, perhaps 3 years old, expelled from his birth pride and wandering in search of territory or opportunity. He had caught the scent of cubs, had followed it out of curiosity or hunger or the violent instinct that made young males kill cubs they did not father, eliminating competing genetics to make way for their own. The dog saw him from a distance, a massive shape moving through the heat shimmer, golden and deadly, a threat of entirely different magnitude from jackals. The dog stood, though his injured leg nearly buckled, and positioned himself at the den entrance once more. This time there was no question of fighting. The lion could kill him with a single paw strike, could brush him aside like an insect. The dog knew this with absolute clarity. But he also knew that running meant death for all the young in the den, meant abandoning everything he had suffered for, meant genetic annihilation. So he stood, and when the lion was 20 meters away, the dog began to bark. Not the aggressive bark of wanting, but something else, something that carried in its rhythm and repetition a message. There is a lioness here. There are cubs here. This territory is claimed. You are trespassing. The lion stopped. His ears swiveled forward, listening to the barking, processing its meaning. Lions understood barking. Wild dogs barked, honey badgers barked, even baboons barked when defending territory. The sound itself carried information about social structure, about defensive posture, about what awaited an intruder. But there was no lioness visible, only a wounded dog, bleeding and exhausted, making claims his body could not enforce. The lion took another step forward. The dog's barking intensified, became almost frantic, and he added a new element. He turned his head and barked into the den, as if communicating with someone inside, as if the lioness was there, listening, preparing to emerge. The lion stopped again. His nose tested the air carefully, and he caught it, faint but undeniable. The scent of an adult lioness, multiple cubs, the territorial markers that said this den was occupied by a resident pride. The dog's bluff was working, because it was not entirely a bluff. The lioness's scent saturated the den, marked the rocks around it, declared ownership in the chemical language all predators understood. The young male lion had no way to know that the lioness was gone, that only a wounded dog stood between him and easy prey. He circled once, testing, his instincts warring between hunger and caution. Killing another lion's cubs was risky, even in the best circumstances. If the mother returned, if she caught the killer, the fight would be brutal and potentially fatal. This den showed signs of recent occupation, of active protection. The dog maintained his barking, his body planted firmly in the entrance, his message unwavering. Not worth it. She is here. She will kill you. Leave now. The lion made his decision. He turned and walked away, not running, but leaving with the deliberate pace of a male who had chosen discretion, who would find easier opportunities elsewhere. He disappeared into the acacia forest, and the dog's barking faded to silence. The dog collapsed. The relief was so overwhelming that his legs simply folded, dropping him to the ground in an ungraceful heap. He had survived another encounter, had protected the den again, but his body was failing. The wounds from the jackal fight were severe. His shoulder was infected. He could feel the heat radiating from the punctures, could smell the sweet, sick scent that meant bacteria multiplying in torn tissue. He needed water. He needed rest. He needed medical attention he would never receive. But he could not leave, could not risk the den while the lioness was still hunting, still gone. The cubs and puppies emerged from the den, tentatively at first, then with more confidence. They were hungry, calling for food that neither he nor the lioness could provide right now. They climbed over his injured body, their small claws and teeth inadvertently causing him pain. But he tolerated it, because they were young and did not understand, because causing them fear or harm would fracture everything. The afternoon dragged into evening. The dog faded in and out of consciousness, his body shutting down systems to conserve energy. He dreamed of water, of his life before, vague memories of humans who had abandoned him, of streets and garbage bins, of times when food came regularly and safety was something he could take for granted. He woke to find one of the puppies, his female with the white chest patch, pressed against his face, licking him with tiny tongue, trying to rouse him the way he had roused her countless times. The puppy whimpered, sensing something wrong with her father, not understanding, but responding to his distress with the only comfort she could offer. The dog licked her back weakly. His daughter, one of the 4 reasons he had risked everything, had walked into the lioness's jaws, had stood against predators that should have killed him a dozen times over. She was alive. They were all alive. That was what mattered. Darkness fell. The temperature dropped, and still the lioness did not return. The dog's mind began to cloud. The infection was spreading, fever building in his system. He tried to stay alert, tried to keep watch, but his body was betraying him, shutting down in the face of trauma it could not heal. A sound brought him back to consciousness. Heavy footfalls, something large approaching. His eyes opened to slits, his muscles tensed for what might be a final fight. But the silhouette that appeared in the moonlight was not an enemy. It was the lioness, returning after 16 hours of hunting, her muzzle soaked in blood, her belly full for the first time in weeks. She had killed a young topee, a juvenile separated from its herd, prey that her hunger had given her the strength and focus to take down despite her weakened state. She stopped when she saw the dog lying motionless in the den entrance, saw the blood on the ground, the defensive wounds on his body, the 7 young animals clustered around him in protective formation, her cubs and his puppies mixed together, keeping watch over the guardian who had kept watch over them. The lioness understood immediately what happened. The dog had held the den alone, had fought, had survived threats that should have killed him. He had fulfilled his part of their impossible contract, had protected her cubs with the same ferocity she would have shown, had proven that their alliance was not convenience, but commitment. She walked to him and lowered her head, sniffing his wounds, assessing the damage. The infection was bad. Without treatment, he would be dead in days. But she could help. Her saliva, her grooming, her antibodies that had evolved to combat the specific bacteria that thrived in wound environments. She began to clean his injuries with her tongue, rough licks that made the dog whimper, but that carried healing properties his body desperately needed. She worked methodically, opening the punctures to drain infection, removing dead tissue, applying nature's antiseptic with the efficiency of millions of evolution. The cubs and puppies watched this strange reversal, the lioness caring for the dog, the predator healing the prey, the mother tending the father. And something in their young minds accepted this as normal, as the way their world worked, as the relationship between the adults who protected them. When the lioness finished cleaning the dog's wounds, she left and returned minutes later dragging a large portion of the topee she had killed. She ripped chunks from it and fed them to the cubs and puppies, who attacked the meat with savage joy, finally getting substantial calories after days of small meals. And she saved a portion for the dog, pushed it toward him with her nose, offering it with the same care she showed her own cubs. The dog was too weak to eat much, but he managed a few bites, and the protein hitting his system began the slow work of rebuilding strength, fighting infection, pulling him back from the edge he had been teetering on. The lioness settled near the den entrance, positioning herself where she could watch both the dog and her cubs. Her presence was a fortress, a promise that no more threats would reach the den tonight, that the dog could rest without keeping watch, that for these hours at least, safety was real rather than hoped for. The dog closed his eyes and slept, true sleep for the first time in days, his body finally trusting that someone else was keeping watch, that he could surrender consciousness without abandoning his responsibilities. And the lioness, full-bellied and alert, maintained her vigil through the night, occasionally grooming the dog's wounds when they seeped, occasionally checking on all 7 young lives under her protection, fulfilling the role she had never expected to play, Mother not just to her own cubs, but to the offspring of the creature she had tried to kill. Guardian of an impossible family that should not exist, but that somehow, against every rule of nature, did. Part 5. The Resolution and Renewal. The dog recovered slowly, over days that blurred into weeks, his body fighting the infection with help from the lioness's constant grooming and the antibacterial properties of her saliva. The puncture wounds closed gradually, leaving new scars to join the ones from her initial capture, a map of violence that had paradoxically led to preservation rather than destruction. During his recovery, the lioness hunted regularly, successful now that she was properly fed and rested. She brought down gazelles, warthogs, once even a young wildebeest that fed them all for 3 days. The cubs and puppies grew fat and strong, their small bodies filling out with healthy fat, their play becoming more vigorous and sustained. And something remarkable happened as they grew. The cubs and puppies began to move as a unit. The lion cubs taught the puppies how to stalk, how to freeze when prey was near, how to coordinate attacks even in play. The puppies taught the cubs how to bark warnings, how to dig quickly when danger approached, how to detect threats by scent that the cat's less sophisticated noses might miss. They developed a hybrid communication system, part feline, part canine, entirely unique. The boldest lion cub and the dog's white-chested female became inseparable, sleeping together, exploring together, learning from each other's strengths. They would hunt insects in tandem, the cub flushing them from hiding with her paws, while the puppy caught them with her quicker reflexes. They were becoming something unprecedented, a cross-species sibling bond that transgressed every boundary naturalists had assumed was absolute. When the dog was strong enough to move normally again, he resumed his hunting. But now he hunted differently, sometimes alone, sometimes with the lioness, and occasionally with the growing cubs and puppies following to learn. He showed them how to track rodents by sound, how to dig out burrowing prey, techniques that complemented the lion's stalking lessons and created a more complete education than either species typically received. The lioness watched these teaching sessions with what might have been approval, or might simply have been the practical recognition that the more the young learned, the better their survival chances. She had stopped seeing the dog as other, had integrated him so fully into her understanding of family that his presence registered as natural, necessary, normal. But the peace could not last forever. It never does in the wild, where stability is always temporary and change is the only constant. The threat came in the coalition, the same group of young males who had killed the lioness's mate months ago. They had established control over a broad territory and now patrolled it regularly, killing cubs they found, asserting dominance through violence. 3 males, all in their prime, all carrying the scars and swagger of successful conquest. The lioness scented them first, caught their markings on the wind one dawn when the air was still and carried messages over long distances. She knew immediately what it meant. The coalition was moving through her area, would find her den eventually, would kill her cubs without hesitation or mercy. She had to move, had to take her cubs and run before the males arrived. But running meant abandoning the den, meant exposing the young during travel, meant losing the secure base that had kept them safe this long. And it meant facing a question she had never expected to consider. What about the dog and his puppies? Traditional lion behavior was clear. Flee alone or with your cubs. Abandon anything that slows you down. Prioritize your own genetics above all else. But the dog had protected her cubs when she could not, had risked his life repeatedly, had earned something that transcended normal pack dynamics. The lioness made her decision. She gathered all 7 young, cubs and puppies together, and began herding them north, away from the coalition's scent trail. The dog followed without question, his body still not fully healed, but functional enough for travel.
They moved through the pre-dawn darkness, the lioness leading, the dog bringing up the rear, the young clustered between them in a tight group. It was slow going. The puppies were not built for distance travel, their shorter legs struggling to keep pace, and the cubs were easily distracted, wanting to stop and explore rather than flee. By mid-morning, they had covered perhaps 8 kilometers. It was not enough. The lioness could still smell the coalition, could sense them closing the distance through some sixth sense that predators develop, that tells them when they are hunted, even when they cannot see the hunters. She found a temporary refuge, a dried riverbed with high banks and a small cave carved by ancient floods. She herded the young inside and positioned herself at the entrance, her body language screaming tension and readiness for violence. The dog understood immediately. He took his position beside her, and together they waited for what was coming. The coalition appeared at noon, when the heat was savage and most animals rested. But these males were not concerned with comfort. They were concerned with dominance, with eliminating competing bloodlines, with the brutal work of genetic warfare that drove much of lion society. They came over the riverbank in a line, 3 massive males, their dark manes full and impressive, their bodies rippling with muscle and violent intent. They stopped when they saw the lioness, their ears pricked forward, their focus sharpening. The largest male stepped forward and roared, a sound that shook the ground, that announced power and imminent conquest, that told the lioness she had one chance to run before they killed everything she loved. But the lioness did not run. She roared back, her voice smaller but filled with maternal fury, with the desperate courage of a parent facing impossible odds. The males advanced. Their intention was clear: kill the lioness if she resisted, kill the cubs regardless, establish complete dominance over the territory. It was what males did, what evolution had programmed them to do, and nothing short of death would stop them. The dog began to bark. It started as warning, but escalated to something else, a continuous piercing barking that carried across the riverbed and beyond, that announced aggression and defense and territory. The males paused, confused by the presence of a dog in this situation, uncertain what it meant. And then, from the north, came an answer to the dog's barking. It started faint, a chorus of barks and whoops and calls that grew louder, closer, more focused. The lioness's ear swiveled toward the sound, her body tense with new alertness. The coalition males heard it too, their confidence flickering for the first time. Over the northern bank of the riverbed came a pack, not of dogs, but of wild dogs, African painted dogs, 15 strong, their mottled coats distinctive and their coordination legendary. They were not allies, not friends, not even particularly interested in the lion's territorial disputes. But they had heard a canid's distress call, had responded to it with the pack instinct that defined their species, and now they were here, assessing the situation with intelligent eyes and calculating minds. Wild dogs did not usually confront lions. The size difference made conflict suicidal, but they were a pack, coordinated and confident, and the lions were intruders in territory the wild dogs had been crossing through for weeks. The largest wild dog, a female alpha with distinctive black patches, barked sharply. It was not a challenge to fight, but a warning. We are here. We are many. Choose your battles carefully. The coalition males found themselves in an unexpected situation. They had come to eliminate cubs, a task that should have taken minutes. But now they faced a defending lioness, a strangely aggressive domestic dog, and a pack of wild dogs who were displaying unusual interest in the conflict. The mathematics had changed. Risk was increasing while benefit remained constant. The males conferred in low rumbles, their body language showing frustration and calculation. Then, slowly, they backed away, not running. Male lions never run, but withdrawing with deliberate dignity,
choosing to find easier opportunities elsewhere. They disappeared over the riverbank, and the immediate crisis passed. The wild dog pack watched them go, then turned their attention to the domestic dog who had called them. The alpha female approached cautiously, sniffing, examining this strange relative who lived with lions and protected lion cubs. The domestic dog lowered himself in submission, showing respect for the alpha's status. But he also positioned himself protectively in front of the cave entrance, making clear that he would defend what was inside if necessary. The alpha seemed to understand. She made a sound, part bark, part chuff, that might have been acknowledgement or greeting, or simply recognition that here was another canine trying to survive in impossible circumstances. Then she turned and led her pack away, back over the northern bank, leaving the lioness and dog alone with their mixed brood. The lioness watched them go, her body slowly relaxing as the threat receded. She looked at the dog, and something passed between them that transcended species, that lived in the space where survival met understanding, where necessity met loyalty. The dog had saved them all. His barking had summoned help neither of them could have predicted, had turned certain death into reprieve. The alliance they had formed was paying dividends neither had imagined, was proving that sometimes, not always, but sometimes, cooperation across boundaries created advantages that pure self-interest could never achieve.
The lioness called her cubs from the cave. They emerged, frightened but unharmed, and pressed against her legs. The puppies followed, and the dog gathered them with gentle nudges, checking each one, counting his offspring with the obsessive concern of all parents. They stayed in the riverbed cave for 2 days, letting the coalition's scent fade from the area, allowing the young to recover from the stress of travel and confrontation. The lioness hunted nearby, bringing food back to the cave. The dog kept watch and taught the young ones to stay quiet, to respond to warning signals, to understand that danger was always present and survival meant constant vigilance. On the 3rd day, they began moving again, heading east toward the permanent river where prey was more abundant and where the coalition's territory did not extend. It took them a week of slow travel, of hiding during the day and moving at dawn and dusk when the heat was less brutal. They reached the river country as the first rains began, early storms that turned the red earth to mud and filled the sky with the smell of renewal. The landscape transformed almost overnight, from brown to green, from dying to thriving. Prey animals migrated through in vast herds, following the grass and water. It was a time of abundance, of possibility, of new beginnings. The lioness found a perfect den site, a cluster of boulders on a low hill that overlooked the river valley, with multiple escape routes and clear sightlines in all directions. She claimed it through scent marking and presence, and the dog accepted it as home, and the 7 young animals, now adolescent, no longer helpless cubs and puppies, explored their new territory with the confidence of creatures who had survived trials that should have killed them. The cubs were nearly 4 months old now, large enough to begin learning serious hunting. The puppies were approaching their full size, still smaller than the lion cubs, but quicker and more agile. They hunted together in their mixed pack, developing techniques that combined feline stealth with canine endurance, creating a hybrid hunting style that was startlingly effective. The lioness and dog had become a team. They communicated through a vocabulary of sounds and gestures that both understood perfectly, but that no human observer could have decoded. When the lioness went to hunt large prey, the dog guarded the young. When the dog foraged for smaller animals, the lioness provided protection. They shared food, shared responsibilities, shared the burden of raising young in a world that specialized in killing them. And gradually, other animals began to notice. A young female lion, expelled from her birth pride, wandered into the territory and approached cautiously. She saw the lioness with her cubs, saw the dog, saw the puppies, and her confusion was evident.
But she was hungry and alone, and when the lioness tolerated her presence, eventually even sharing a kill, she stayed. The addition of a second lioness changed the dynamics. Now there were two adults to hunt cooperatively, to bring down larger prey more efficiently. The dog became less hunter and more guardian, using his keen senses to warn of danger, while the lionesses provided the bulk of the food. The mixed family grew. The lion cubs began to show the distinctive features of their gender, the male's mane starting to darken, the females becoming leaner and more focused. The puppies developed their own distinct personalities. One who loved to dig, one who was the best tracker, one who could bark warnings at frequencies that seemed to carry farther than normal, and the white-chested female who remained closest to the lion cubs, who moved between species as if there were no boundary at all. By the time the rains ended and the dry season returned, the family had established itself as a permanent fixture of the river territory. Other predators learned to recognize and avoid them. The lionesses were too skilled, the dogs' warnings too accurate, the young ones too well protected. They had carved out a niche that should not have existed, had proven that under the right circumstances, cooperation could trump competition. The lioness gave birth to a new litter, 4 cubs fathered by a wandering male she had mated with during the previous year. She brought them to the den she shared with the dog, and without hesitation he accepted them into his protection. The older cubs and puppies, now approaching a year old, became babysitters and teachers, showing the new cubs how to play, how to stalk, how to avoid danger. And the dog's puppies, now fully grown, remained. They did not leave to find other dogs, did not seek out their own kind. They stayed with the lions, stayed with their father, stayed with the family that had formed around them. They were something unprecedented. Domestic dogs living wild as part of a lion pride, integrated so completely that the distinction between species became almost meaningless. Researchers eventually discovered them, a wildlife documentary team that had heard rumors of an unusual group near the permanent river. They filmed from a distance, documenting the impossible family, the cross-species cooperation, the young animals that played and hunted and slept together without apparent awareness that they were supposed to be enemies. The footage spread around the world. Scientists debated what it meant, how it could exist, whether it represented an evolutionary aberration or a glimpse of some deeper truth about the plasticity of animal behavior. But those debates were abstract, theoretical, disconnected from the daily reality of survival and cooperation that defined the family's existence. On the ground, in the territory by the river, the lioness and the dog simply continued. They hunted, protected, taught, and raised their young.
They faced threats together: hyenas, other lions, floods and droughts and disease. Some of their offspring survived to adulthood. Some died, because death is part of life in the wild, because perfection does not exist and loss is inevitable. But the core family persisted. Through seasons and years, through challenges that would have destroyed weaker alliances, they maintained their impossible bond. The lioness eventually grew old, her muzzle graying, her movements slowing. The dog aged too, his black patches turning white, his body wearing down from years of hard living. But they stayed together until the end. When the lioness finally died, peacefully, in her sleep, surrounded by cubs and grandcubs and the dog who had become her most loyal companion, the dog remained for 3 days beside her body, keeping guard one final time, honoring the creature who had chosen to spare his life and had somehow, impossibly, become his family. The dog died 2 weeks later, his body simply giving out after years of pushing beyond normal limits. The now adult cubs and puppies gathered around him, touched him with noses and paws, mourned in their own ways. And then they continued, carrying forward the lessons both parents had taught, spreading into the territory as independent adults, but maintaining connections,
returning occasionally to the den site where it had all begun, where a lioness had caught a stray dog and had discovered that he was trying to do exactly what she was doing, keep his children alive against a world designed to kill them. The forest did not wait for the dog's song. He had no song to give. But he had given something else, something equally important, proof that survival sometimes requires abandoning the old rules, that cooperation can transcend competition, that parents of any species recognize each other in the desperate work of keeping young alive, and that occasionally, rarely but really, the wild shows mercy, not through nature, but through the choices individuals make when faced with impossible situations. Years later, researchers documented lion prides in the area that tolerated domestic dogs, that hunted cooperatively with them, that integrated them into their social structures in ways that defied traditional understanding. The behavior had spread, had been learned and taught, had become part of the local culture in that specific territory. It was a legacy neither the lioness nor the dog could have imagined. But it was real, measurable, a permanent change in how two species interacted in that specific place. And at the heart of it was a single impossible moment, when a lioness had held a dog in her jaws and had chosen, for reasons she probably never fully understood, to put him down instead of killing him. That choice had echoed forward in time, had rippled outward in consequences that were still unfolding. It was a small miracle in a world that dealt mostly in violence and loss. But miracles, however small, still count. They still matter. And they still give hope that nature, for all its cruelty, occasionally makes space for something softer, something that resembles grace, something that reminds us that survival is not just about the strongest or fastest, but sometimes about the wisest, the most adaptable, the ones brave enough to try something that has never worked before and might not work now, but just possibly could if everyone commits to the impossible together. The sun set over the river territory, painting the water gold and orange. In the distance, a mixed group of lions and dogs moved together through the tall grass, hunting as twilight descended. Their voices, roars and barks, blending into a chorus that belonged to neither species alone, but to both together. A sound that should not exist, but that rang clear and strong across the darkening savanna. The story ended not with an ending, but with continuation. And that, perhaps, was the truest ending of all.